Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a true delight to have been asked to give a second talk today, for me at least. It's totally different, so if you were here earlier, there will be no overlap, I hope. But seriously, it's been a real privilege to be asked to give this insight talk. Also rather terrifying, as the proofs for the new life of Tchaikovsky I've just finished were being done about a month ago. They've gone, and then you write a lecture later and you think, oh gosh, I shouldn't have said it like that in the book, or if only I could go and say it again in a different way. But it's been a wonderful chance to revisit very familiar material from a very new angle and for a very different context. So sometime during the spring of 1877, Tchaikovsky found himself at the Moscow home of his friend, the singer Elizaveta Lavrovskaya. He'd been looking out for a possible libretto for an opera for some time, but was becoming increasingly irritated by what he saw as the conventionality and artifice of just about every opera plot around him, Wagner and Verdi above all. So perhaps inevitably, given the company, the conversation turned to subjects that might be suitable for operatic treatment. And here is Tchaikovsky's letter. Lavrovskaya's stupid husband churned out indescribable rubbish and suggested the most impossible subjects. Elizaveta Andreevna was silent and smiled good-naturedly, then suddenly said, "But what about Eugene Onegin?" This suggestion was so incredible that I said nothing. Then, later, when I was dining alone, I remembered about Onegin, thought it over, began to find Lavrovskaya's idea possible, then was carried away by the idea, and by the end of the meal had decided upon it. I immediately ran to find a copy of Pushkin. I eventually tracked one down, went home, reread it with delight, and spent a completely sleepless night, the result of which was a scenario for a delightful opera with the libretto by Pushkin. And it's true that the draft libretto that he penned that evening is the very same as the opera we now know. He immediately conceived of a shape and structure, the break between the acts and the scenes and the key points. Now, for literary scholars, Tchaikovsky's choice of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin has long been a matter of debate and, shall we say, even disappointment. All the things that make the original novel in verse so engaging, its chatty narrator, its sophisticated parodies of literary form, its satirical portrayal of early 19th century Russian high society, all of these are jettisoned in favour of a simple, romantic plot that throws the focus onto the very features of the novel that is least well developed in it, the action and its characters. And it is this interest in character that I want to explore today, because how Tchaikovsky fashioned memorable, sympathetic, three-dimensional individuals out of Pushkin's playful novel is at the heart of why the opera works so very well on the stage. A clue to Tchaikovsky's aims when composing Onegin can be found in a letter that he wrote to his patron, Nadezhda von Meck, shortly after he completed it. Those who are capable of finding in the opera the musical recreation of ordinary, simple emotions, common to all humanity and far removed from the tragic, the theatrical, may, I hope, be pleased with it. In short, the opera has been composed sincerely, and it is in the sincerity that I place all my hopes. But Tchaikovsky was under no illusion about the complexities of staging this new, radically new work, with its subtle and revolutionary emphasis on emotional truth. "Where shall I find a Tatiana," he said, "the one whom Pushkin imagined and whom I have tried to embody in music? Where will be that artist able even to approach the ideal of Onegin, of that cold dandy filled to the core with worldly bon ton? From where shall I be able to get a Liensky, an 18-year-old youth with thick curls, with the impetuous and individual ways of a young poet a la Schiller? How Pushkin's delightful picture will be cheapened when it is transferred to the stage with its routine, its muddle-headed traditions, its veterans of both sexes who shamelessly take on the roles of 16-year-old girls and beardless youths." The question of how Garsington will stage this and capture Tchaikovsky's characters on stage is something we will find out only later this summer. But for the purposes of my talk this evening, I want to concentrate on this question of sincerity and how Tchaikovsky mined a vein of empathy that was, for all its playfulness and cleverness, inherent in Pushkin's original novel. But before doing so, I want to suggest that Tchaikovsky's emotional involvement in Pushkin's Eugene Onegin was initially motivated by personal biographical factors. As is well known, Tchaikovsky was gay, but in the summer of 1876 he took the momentous decision to marry, partly to please his father, partly also to provide himself with companionship and domestic comfort, but of course, most of all, to stem what was becoming growing public discussion about his private life. An opportunity to settle down and marry presented itself, oddly enough, in April or May the next year, when Tchaikovsky received an ardent expression of love from a student at the Moscow Conservatory, Antonina Milyukova. For the time being, Tchaikovsky ignored this letter as he recalled to his friend Nikolai Kashkin because he was so busy writing his opera. I was entirely preoccupied at the time with thoughts about Eugene Onegin, i.e. about Tatiana, whose letter had originally drawn me to composing the opera. I was completely buried in my composition and had grown so close to the character of Tatiana that she and all around her started to seem real to me. I loved Tatiana and was terribly angry with Onegin, whom I saw as a cold and heartless fop. When I received Mademoiselle Milyukova's second letter, in which she complained that she had not received a reply to the first one, everything became associated with my conception of Tatiana. And it seemed to me that I had behaved infinitely worse than Onegin. I was genuinely angry with myself for my heartless treatment of a girl who had fallen in love with me. I was constantly under the influence of my genuine anger with Onegin for his casual and flippant treatment of Tatiana. It seemed to me that to behave like Onegin would be heartless and quite impermissible on my part. So here we have a terrible and tragic case of Tchaikovsky mistaking art for life. So engrossed in composing his opera and engaging so intimately with the emotional predicament of its characters, he translated their situation onto his own. This is, of course, exactly the mistake that Tatiana makes in Pushkin's novel. Brought up on a diet of French and English sentimental fiction, she fatally confuses the real Onegin with the romantic hero her reading has encouraged her to dream of. Although Tchaikovsky's decision to marry Antonina Milyukova in the summer of 1877 was to have painful consequences for both parties, particularly painful for Antonina, who never divorced Tchaikovsky, had a common law marriage with an impecunious lawyer who had 3 children, all of whom were placed in orphanages and died at an early age, and herself was confined to an asylum. We must remember that story as well as the tragic side of it for Tchaikovsky. This story perhaps does at least explain something of the emotional intensity of the opera at which Tchaikovsky was then at work. So how does Tchaikovsky make us, the audience, share in his emotional response to Pushkin's original principal characters? I'm going to take them one by one, Tatiana, Liensky, and then Onegin, thinking about what Tchaikovsky does to Pushkin in terms of narrative perspective, before turning to a character, Prince Gremin, who is often left out of the picture, but who for me is a key, if not the key, to the opera as a whole, and its powerful sense of emotional truthfulness. As you will have heard many times today, one of the most striking features of Pushkin's original novel is the prominent role played by its narrator. It is the narrator who introduces us to the main characters, comments on their actions, even helps us to gain access to their thoughts and feelings. Take, for example, Tatiana's confession of love to Onegin. It's a letter, and as a letter, it is not a document to which we have direct access as readers. It is not a letter written to us. It is presented to us, however, by the narrator, who seems to have come into possession of a copy of it. And as he writes, he's reading the original in front of him. There's a picture of Antonina. I'm using, again, the same Charles Johnson translation that inspired Vikram Seth's Golden Gate. Tatiana's letter, treasured ever as sacred, lies before me still. I read with secret pain and never can read enough to get my fill. But there's a problem with this letter. It's written in French. I see another problem looming. To save the honour of our land, I must translate. There's no presuming. The letter from Tatiana's hand. Her Russian was as thin as vapour. She never read a Russian paper. Our native speech had never sprung, unhesitating, from her tongue. She wrote in French. What a confession. So, the version we read in Pushkin is distanced from us, presented at one remove from the original, in what the narrator calls a weak version, an incomplete, pale transcript of a vivid master. All of this, of course, is lost in the opera. Although Tchaikovsky's stage direction states that we see Tatiana writing, and most productions that I've seen make an attempt to suggest this, usually rushing to a table, grabbing paper and quill or whatever it is. But what we actually hear and feel is her singing. It is a voice we hear, not a text we read. It is an embodied voice, not a stream of words on the page. And embodied voices have a powerful sense of emotion and physicality that draw us into the predicament of the opera's characters. Thinking about the letter scene, we hear the words, but what is often thrilling about it is the sheer sound of the voice. It's a virtuoso piece, a demanding set piece for a serious soprano. And we are as moved as much by that physical experience of vocality as by the details of the text, I think. This is perhaps obvious, but it's worth repeating. But something else happens when Tchaikovsky stages Tatiana's letter scene, and one which gives a clue to how the opera's sympathy is created. In the novel, we read the letter, but we read it illicitly and retrospectively. But in the opera, we hear Tatiana struggling in the here and now, the present moment, to express her thoughts as they come to her. The opera is vivid and immediate, where the novel is ironic and distanced. All of the gaps and breaks and missing information that characterize the way Tatiana's letter is presented in the novel, translated from French into Russian, transcribed by the narrator who seems to have acquired it himself, all of these distances are effaced. Crucially, the letter is not addressed to us at all. It's not even something that's addressed to the narrator. It's written to Onegin, a private document. There is sense, therefore, a strong sense, that we are overhearing words not meant for us. We break the seal of confidence that binds Tatiana and Onegin together. Now, it is, of course, one of fiction's great conceits that we can read other people's letters and get into their minds without compromising our moral complacency. But think for a moment, that's what all fiction is doing. When the letter is sung, however, it suddenly seems as if that letter is written to us. The person sitting at the back of the stalls is pinned to his or her seat by that voice sung, by that singer singing on that occasion. What Tchaikovsky does is transform literary parody into something closer to theatrical soliloquy. Now, opera theorists like to call things, and this is called aria time. And it's a particular challenge, I think, for directors to do things during aria time, to come up with action that matches an aria's contents, but somehow doesn't distract from what is going on in the inner life of the character on the stage. Dialogue and recitative move the action on. They introduce new characters. They fill in information that we need to know to follow the plot. They're like real speech, and they often happen with a degree of verisimilitude. But in aria time, the action is frozen, and we gain an insight into the emotions of the lead characters, as in the Countess's aria Dove sono, in The Marriage of Figaro, perhaps. But what distinguishes aria time in Onegin is this very strange sense that it has always been addressed to someone other than the audience, at least as they occur in Pushkin's original novel, and at least as they are staged in the opera house. We're not just entering Tatiana's head, we are seeing her write a letter that we cannot ourselves read. Tatiana's letter is the most obvious example which is why I wanted to start there, and it's where Tchaikovsky began his opera. But a similar point can be made about Lienski's Act 2 aria 2. In Pushkin's novel, there's a substantial gap between the end of Tatiana's name day party, after which Liensky challenges Onegin to a duel for flirting with his betrothed Olga. And there's a gap then between that and the duel itself, which takes up about 20 stanzas. During this time, Pushkin describes Liensky contemplating the duel and then, in a fit of poetic intoxication, writing a farewell poem. Here it is. I won't read it all. Once home, he brought out and inspected his pistols, laid them in the case, undressed by candlelight, selected and opened Schiller. But the embrace, and on it goes, this process of writing, of reading, of thinking. His verse, compact of amorous trash and worse, flows and reverberates. In lyric frenzy sunk like Delvig, one of Pushkin's contemporaries and friends, when he's dining drunk. By chance, those verses haven't been vanished. I keep them and will quote them here. It's like Tatiana's letter, a document that's mysteriously present in the narrator's possession. Whither, oh whither are ye banished, my golden days, when spring was dear? That's, of course, the aria that we know. But in Pushkin's original, this poem is presented as a derivative piece of doggerel, copied from Schiller and German Romanticism, containing also a whole series of allusions to Pushkin's own contemporaries, at least for those well versed enough in Russian literature to spot them. Like Tatiana's letter, it's found its way into the possession of the narrator. But in the opera, these two events, the name day party and the duel, are run together directly. Pushkin's ironizing commentary is suppressed, and although Liensky's aria still contains its address to Olga and the hope that he won't be forgotten by her, it's a moment that we not only overhear, but we overhear with extraordinary theatrical intimacy. It was perhaps obvious that Tchaikovsky should have turned to these two texts, Tatiana's letter and Liensky's farewell verses, as the key moments in his opera. Pushkin's text presented him with ready-made material that was ideal for musical setting. He could just lift the letter and lift the poem. And interestingly, as I said, he began the composition of the opera with Tatiana's letter scene in the spring of 1877, and he completed it with Liensky's farewell verses in San Remo in January 1878. And these great lyric moments anchor the dramatic action of Acts 1 and Act 2, respectively. But for all the ease with which Tchaikovsky could set these texts, a major change of tone took place. This is partly to do with partly a product of the radical compression that took place in producing the libretto. An awful lot had to be simply jettisoned to produce a text which wasn't going to be too long. But most particularly, this was the result of removing the narrator and his role in distancing and ironizing Tatiana's and Liensky's words, which become, in Tchaikovsky, instances of sincerely expressed emotional truth that are directly addressed to the audience, rather than written to their particular reader. Turning to the other characters in the opera, we come across a rather different set of problems. Onegin himself is a real problem when it comes to providing lyric introspection. Partly this is a result of Pushkin's own treatment of his hero. Tatiana and Liensky both get substantial instances of lyric expression that lends themselves well to operatic realization. Onegin gets a series of letters at the end, but he seems to me at least to be a more taciturn character, more talked about than talking. We get a number of extended descriptions of his background and upbringing by the narrator, and he is the object of gossip and speculation when he visits Tatiana's country estate, as well as when he returns to St. Petersburg high society at the end of the novel. And in a very striking scene that perhaps suggests Pushkin may have known about a certain Lizzie Bennet going to Pemberley in Pride and Prejudice. Think about it. Two couples, a letter scene, the trip to the library. It was available in French translation, Pride and Prejudice. Pushkin's library copies seem to have been uncut, so we can't prove he'd read this. But Tatiana goes to Onegin's library and discovers more about him from visiting his empty library and reading his reading than about actually ever talking to him in person. So at last, feature by feature, Tatiana begins to understand more thoroughly, thank God, the creature for whom her passion had been planned by fate's decree, this freakish stranger who walks with sorrow and with danger, whether from hell, heaven or from hell, this angel, this proud devil, tell, what is he? Just an apparition? A shadow, null and meaningless? A Muscovite in herald dress? A modish second-hand edition? A glossary of smart argot? A parodistic raree show? So this sense that Onegin is, to a large extent, made up of the fragmentary impressions of other people causes a problem for Tchaikovsky, since opera characters have to express themselves in the first person on the stage. And they have to do this directly to us. Even Olga, who is barely there in the book, gets a better chance of it in her lovely Act 1 Arioso, which is one of the most spontaneous and lovely pieces in the whole opera, and Tchaikovsky milks it for all it's worth. So in Act 1, Tchaikovsky hits upon a very ingenious solution to portraying Onegin on stage. We first encounter him as he is introduced to the Larin family by Lenski. His character at this point is expressed in a few pieces of dialogue, some genteel pleasantries to his hosts, and some caustic comments about Olga's lack of beauty to Lenski. He leaves the stage with Tatiana, while Lenski sings of his love to Olga, and when Onegin returns, is to sing a brief and extremely strange arioso about his uncle's poor health. Heaven knows what Tatiana makes of this piece of time-wasting or filling, whatever it is. It's not really much for the opera's main male protagonist to get his teeth into. And if we know the novel well, there is a sense of irony and humour here, because these are the very opening words of the novel. And when we read them for the first time, we think, heavens, who is this voice? Who is speaking? What is this strange disquisition about the mortality of a dying uncle to do with anything? But the most important feature, I think, of this first substantial piece of music for Onegin is that these words are addressed to Tatiana. Unlike the letter scene or Lenski's verses, they are not expressions of him in aria time, so that we as the audience can get a view of him. They are words passed to another character in the opera, which we overhear. Something similar might be said about the more substantial aria, and that we're going to hear later this evening, that Onegin sings at the end of Act 2. He has read Tatiana's letter, comes to reproach her for not for the intensity of her emotions, but for the rashness of writing so candidly to a stranger. It is a more substantial piece of lyric expression than the first brief piece of arioso that we heard earlier in the scene. But to my mind, it doesn't really achieve the same intensity of motion as the other's great lyric scenes, Lenski's aria in Act 2 or Tatiana's letter scene. That is revealing in and of itself. Onegin never quite manages the sincerity and susceptibility of the other characters, at least at this point in the opera. His words are a way of warning Tatiana off, rather than revealing himself truthfully, whether to us or to her, or indeed even to himself. And we see plenty of Onegin on stage, but usually in the company of other people. His lines are instances of dialogue, commentary, but rarely self-expression or self-revelation. This is the other long stanza, which he sings, Pushkin writes, and then Tchaikovsky sets, when he talks about not being able to marry. But they are words addressed to Tatiana. Whether they are self-revelation, self-expression, is open to debate, I think. Moving to the end of the scene, where Lenski challenges Onegin to a duel, we see another technique for creating Onegin's voice. Pushkin gives everything in the third person. He had done. Evgeny loved him, should have played a different part. Tchaikovsky has to turn everything into the first person. And this was the very thing that Turgenev hated about the opera, was the fact that all of the third-person narration, which is so witty, ironic, playful, distancing, became trite and romantic nonsense when turned into first-person speech in the mouths of the characters. Tchaikovsky rewrites everything, therefore, as first-person confession. And interestingly, to me, it suggests how few of Pushkin's words could be taken over directly for Onegin, and how much work had to be done to manipulate them to make sense in the opera. And this might perhaps have something to do with the tension in the novel between its poetry and its prosiness. Onegin might be a character who is more present in the prosiness of the novel through its chatty narrator, the enjambment between the lines, the description by the narrator of stuff going on, rather than in the first-person expressions of its other characters. Lenski and Tatiana seem closer to its more poetic qualities. Certainly Lenski does. And so in adapting the character of Onegin for the stage, Tchaikovsky treats him as one might treat a novel or a short story, taking third-person narration and interior monologue and transferring it into direct speech. The same happens at the end of Act 3. Onegin, Pushkin certainly identifies with Onegin, I'm not sure Tchaikovsky does. Onegin returns to Russia and Russian society, but is haunted by the guilt that he feels for his role in killing his friend. Pushkin describes this in 2 stanzas of third-person narrative, which Tchaikovsky has to turn into direct speech. And then, when Onegin sees Tatiana, now the wife of a prince and general and a society beauty, the same thing happens. And on the left you see Charles Johnson's version of that moment in the third person. Was she the Tanya, he'd exhorted in solitude, in the far backwards, deepest heart? Here is she the Tatiana I exhorted. When one knows the novel well, it's striking how much of Onegin's text has to come from third-person narration turned into direct speech. At last, it seems as though we're hearing Onegin, as we have previously heard Lenski, poetically, expressively, emotionally. There's one more instance of it there. What ails him? What ails me? He's in some strange days. I'm in some strange days. There's a lot of this in Act 3. When Onegin realizes that he is in love with Tatiana, he cannot find words of his own. When Onegin sings of his love for Tatiana, he does so in words and music that are borrowed from Tatiana's letter scene. He has become exactly what Tatiana grasps when she goes to his library: a parody, an empty vessel, a blank canvas. At the most intimate and intense moment of his expressive inner life, he can find no words, not because these are things up beyond him, but because he can only ever copy or emulate. And Tchaikovsky intuits this fully. The music that Onegin sings at this point is a quotation of Tatiana's letter scene. We, like Tatiana, have good reason to doubt the authenticity of Onegin's sudden realization of his love. As he worked on the opera, Tchaikovsky grew ever more impatient with Onegin, and I think we hear this in the way that Onegin's music borrows and quotes things we have already heard elsewhere in the opera. Now, Pushkin began this process, but it is Tchaikovsky who takes it to the next level and realizes it completely on the operatic stage. How on earth one sings sincerely, truthfully, and embodiedly a character who is none of those things is an extraordinary challenge for any singer, I suspect. How one even performs fully that which is itself empty is an extraordinary operatic coup, I think. And it reveals how very carefully Tchaikovsky had read Pushkin, but equally how very confident he could be in completely changing the emotional world of the opera. So far, then, we've seen characters who Tchaikovsky could take directly from the Pushkin novel and transpose into operatic form, Tatiana and Lenski, and another character, Onegin, who required a little bit of fixing, a bit of adaptation to get him on the stage. But there's one more character who shows Tchaikovsky's compelling sense of how to go about creating simplicity and sincerity. This is Prince Gremin. In Pushkin, we know nothing of Tatiana's husband other than that he is a fat general, Prince N. No name, very little history. His role is to present Tatiana as someone stoic, faithful, and glitteringly successful in high society. Tchaikovsky, by contrast, gives him a name, an aria, a role, and he writes for him, I think, the most ardent and unfeigned music in the opera. And it is his name that gives a clue to his character, albeit ironically. Gremin comes from the Russian verb grimit, which means to thunder or to make a racket. Yet Gremin's music is the most tender and inward of the whole opera. And it's another one of the opera's scenes of address. Tatiana writes to Onegin. Onegin lectures Tatiana. Lenski writes a farewell poem to Olga. Now Gremin sings of his love for Tatiana to Onegin. Yet, like Tatiana's letter or Lenski's poem, it's slowly transformed into a moment of sincere poetic self-revelation when it is performed, as according to the conventions of operatic soliloquy to the audience. Like Tatiana's letter scene or Lenski's aria, but unlike Onegin's brief snatches of songfulness, it is often sung as a standalone concert number. To be sure, Gremin's words are not solely the product of Tchaikovsky's own invention, but they are very cleverly compiled from various bits of Pushkin's novel. But the music comes together in a wholefulness and integrity that has its own sense, and it constitutes, I would argue, the opera's most intense expression of sincerity and truthfulness, the very thing he wanted to achieve. And it's interesting that he had to invent a character to make it happen. Gremin's aria not only expresses a fictional character's touching confession of late and unexpected love, but also brings us back to the question of Tchaikovsky's autobiographical investment in composing Eugene Onegin in the first place. Gremin's words seem to articulate Tchaikovsky's own aspirations for a kind of loving and sustaining relationship that he, in the end, would never come to enjoy in his life. The aria reveals the disjuncture between Tchaikovsky's life and his art, as he made the tragic mistake of marrying a woman he didn't and couldn't love. In an opera where all the protagonists are terribly young, Gremin's voice is not just one of experience, it's also one of self-knowledge, a quality fatally lacking elsewhere in the work, and certainly one in which Tchaikovsky was himself in short supply in 1877. And surely one of the reasons for the overwhelming poignancy of Gremin's aria is that it derives from Tchaikovsky's empathetic ability to evoke in art the very thing he could only ever imagine in life. And in this respect, the whole of Act 3 is a portrait of Tchaikovsky's own character and the contrasting facets of that character. Acts 1 and 2 contain the opera's most expressive lyric moments, the young Tatiana's letter scene, and Lenski's farewell aria, but it is the final act that best sums up the opera's underlying emotional significance. Onegin is the fictional version of the man that Tchaikovsky feared to become by spurning Antonina Milyukova. And his final anguish, ignominy, anguish, oh my pitiful fate, suggests something of Tchaikovsky's own well-attested emotional fertility. Gremin expresses the very thing that Tchaikovsky most longed for, yet would never achieve. But it is Tatiana who best illustrates the path that Tchaikovsky would take once he had survived the failure of his marriage. One of the reasons that Gremin is such a compelling character is that he expresses experience and wisdom. And these are the qualities with which the opera opens. In the very first scene, we see Tatiana's mother and her nanny as they look back on the past and remember how their own youthful love affairs gave way to the acquiescence of adulthood. Habit is sent from us to us from above in place of happiness. Yes, that's how it is. Habit is sent from above in place of happiness. This is how it's set in Tchaikovsky. And these words ring through the opening scene and through the rest of the opera. This is the lesson that Tatiana learns by the end of the opera about happiness as a substitute, as habit as a substitute for happiness. She chooses loyalty to Griemin over the love she very painfully still feels for Onegin. If Pushkin began his novel in the spirit of parody, he ended it in the spirit of sympathy, and his treatment of Tatiana is the greatest proof of this evolution of his emotional involvement in the life of its protagonists, and it is this empathy that Tchaikovsky so effectively picks up on. Tchaikovsky's Tatiana's lesson was also the very lesson that Tchaikovsky learnt during the course of 1877. And he often quoted Pushkin's dictum that happiness is sent from above in place, is sent from above in place of happiness. In his correspondence, it crops up on a regular basis in his letters in the late 1870s. As he wrote to Nadezhda von Meck on the 30th of August 1877, still somehow hoping to make a marriage work, he compared his own situation to that of the moral predicament of Eugene Onegin. It will be difficult for me to leave here. He's been on the summer estate of his sister. After the disquiet that I've experienced, I have so enjoyed the piece here. In any case, I shall leave here a healthy person who has gained enough strength for the struggle with fate. Not a nice way to talk about going back to your recently married wife, but still. But the main thing is that I do not cherish false hopes. I know that there will be difficult moments, but then habit will come along, something that, as Pushkin says, is sent from above in place of happiness. After all, I grew accustomed to my classes at the conservatory. He'd been professor of harmony and counterpoint there from 1866 and did not enjoy it one bit, which once seemed to me the greatest of disasters. In the end, as we know well, habit never reconciled Tchaikovsky to his marriage to Antonina and to his life as a husband. But habit, routine, discipline, and hard work helped him through the emotional crisis of the summer and autumn of 1877 and turned him, in fact, to an incredibly self-aware, self-examining individual, and who found, if not happiness, then contentment through habit. Eugene Onegin, then, was not just a lesson in art, it proved to be a fundamental lesson in life too. Thank you very much.
I'm going to sing the first aria where Onegin is lecturing Tatiana, and then we're going to do the final passionate outburst to illustrate the difference in those.
Вы мне писали, не отпирайтесь. Я прочел души доверчивой признания, любви невинной излияния. Мне ваша искренность мила, она волнение привела давно умолкнувшие чувства, но восхвалить я не хочу. Я за нее вам отплачу признанием также без искусства. Ешись, повет мою, себя на суд вам отдаю. Когда безжизнь домашним кругом я ограничиться хотел, когда б мне быть с отцом-супругом приятный жребий повелел, то верно, кроме вас одной невесты не искал иной. Но я не создан для блаженства, ему чужда душа моя. Напрасны ваши совершенства, их недостоин вовсе я. Поверьте, совесть том порукой, супружество нам будет мукой. Я сколько ни любил бы вас, привыкнув раз люблю тотчас. Судите ж вы, какие розы нам заготовить к имене. И, может быть, намного дней. Мечтами года нет возврата, нет возврата, не обновлю души моей. Я вас люблю любовью брата, и, может быть, еще сильней. И, может быть, еще нежней. Послушайтесь меня без гнева, сменить не раз молодая дева. Та самая Татьяна, которая наедине в глухой далекой стороне в благом пилу нравоучения читал когда-то настолденья. Та девочка, которая пренебрегал в смиренной долье, ужели то она была так равнодушна, так смела? Но что со мной? Я как во сне. Что же вернулось в глубине души холодной и ленивой? Досада, суетность, и вновь забота юности, любовь. Увы, сомнения нет, влюблен, как мальчик, полный страсти юной. Пускай погибну я не прежде, ослепительной надежде. Вкушу волшебный яд желаний, глупиус, не сбыть очной мечтой, везде, везде, он предо мной, образ желанный, дорогой, везде, везде, он предо